Are strategy RPGs a dead-end genre? Now that I have your attention, let me just say, yes. Maybe. They are. If you'd like to stick around, and let me give some context as to why I feel that way, please do. If not, consider some of the other stuff I have on this channel. It's mostly strategy RPG stuff.
Otherwise, settle in and get ready for this story.
I recently started looking at older games that I have in my backlog and reviewing them, asking the question, do they hold up? And after looking at a few of them, I opened the next game to the choice of the viewers of the channel, who selected Final Fantasy Tactics War of the Lions. If you're unfamiliar with the game, FFTWOTL, that's how we're going to refer to it from now on, is a strategy RPG set in the Final Fantasy world of Ivalice, where you take control of Ramza Beowulf and his followers as you attempt to uncover a political plot where everyone is vying for control except you, because you believe that the crown is above your station and that you should fight for justice and not power. Anyway, the game is a PSP port of the PlayStation 1 original from 1997, with some extras thrown in, including an entire rewrite of the script of the PS1 game, exchanging the straightforward modern English version for a flowery Shakespearean effort that fits better with the world it's set into. In my opinion, of course. Now, I'd only ever gotten halfway through Final Fantasy Tactics and wanted to finish the job this time, with a view to writing and producing a video on how it holds up versus modern contemporaries of the genre. But as I was playing through the game, I came to a rather depressing realization. I believe that Final Fantasy Tactics is the peak of strategy RPGs, and while some games have come close to the freedom that mechanics in this game offer, nothing has given me the same thrill of having figured out a combination of skills or breaking mechanics like it in the 28 years that I've been playing this genre. So in case you've never played Final Fantasy Tactics, let me explain what it is that the game does so brilliantly. It's all about choice. Player choice is one of the greatest parts of interactive media and video games. The idea of being in control of your own destiny and laying out your own path to get there. Final Fantasy Tactics might be one of the greatest visions of that ideal in video game history, simply because of its job system, a system that allows you to change an archer to a mage, a knight to a monk, or a mystic to a thief. Now that in itself is nothing really new, and especially so in RPGs. But what was new at the time, and I feel hasn't been reached since, is the way that you're allowed to do this at will, earn some job points, unlock a skill, and then mix and match all those different classes' skills together to form a type of omni-class. And then of course you can do this for every character that you have under your control, meaning that you could have a squad of gun-toting chemists, destroying enemies from miles away and having the utility to heal one another. Or you could have a finely honed squad, each one a master of their own field, and filling a role that you need for this next difficult battle. This level of freedom lends so well to experimentation that when I told my Discord friends that I was going to play this game, all of them offered character builds that they thought were game-breaking, and all of them were different. Any game that can still give a bunch of eureka theory crafting moments 25 years on has to be something special. And I hope that this article can encourage you to try that game out. So from one wonderful moment returns the crux of this video, because that's when I started to wonder, is this it for SRPGs? Will there be a game like it in the next 5, 10, 20 years that can give me that same feeling ever again? I'm getting ahead of myself, so let's continue by looking at some of the games that are most likely inspired by Final Fantasy Tactics, and see if I can't quantify why they can't seem to move past a game that is either 25 or 15 years old at this point, depending on which version that you prefer. Game 1. Disgaea. I want to love the Disgaea series so much. I love the anime plot lines the games have, the silly way the characters react to the world-ending consequences that most protagonists would normally be overwhelmed by. Disgaea laughs in the face of these, most times literally. Disgaea 1, for example, has you play as the new king of the underworld, attempting to rally your subjects as you've been asleep for a while, only to wake up and discover someone killed your dad and now that you're in charge, and lots of bonkers plot lines ensue, all with very good storytelling that had me enjoying every time a cutscene played. That isn't like Final Fantasy Tactics at all, screamed the 5 people watching this video. Please like and subscribe so I can piss off more people, by the way. So let me say that in everything that Final Fantasy Tactics does mechanically, I think Disgaea does almost all of it too, only there's more of it everywhere. In Disgaea, you make new soldiers to fight for your cause that have random skills and stats, and if they aren't to your liking, you can influence that by fighting. Your items and weapons can be upgraded by fighting, and of course your existing team levels up by fighting. As you can probably imagine, the thing that I have against Disgaea is that there's too much fighting going on. Every aspect of the game is resolved by you caving skulls in, and it's too grindy. Is that a word? Hang on. Well, there's no red line under it in Google Docs, so I think we're good. Disgaea is too grindy for me. And since I know everything, and my opinions are absolute, you all hate grinding too. It's a shame, because having discussed this aspect of the games with my brain trust, that's my Discord link in description, we came to the conclusion that speeding up battles, or even automating certain ones, would have been super beneficial to the game. What's interesting is that Disgaea 6 supposedly has this, but wasn't well received. So maybe we know nothing. But one thing we do know, that makes sense, is that more fighting does not make Disgaea better than Final Fantasy Tactics. And whilst grinding can be accomplished in Final Fantasy Tactics, it is not essential to having an amazing experience. Next game! Game 2. Fire Emblem. Oh god, here it is. The tinderbox that's going to set my comments section on fire. Well, let me just get this out of the way then. Fire Emblem has some elements that are better than Final Fantasy Tactics. It feels weird for me to say, but it's true. If you want romance in your strategy RPG, Fire Emblem is almost certainly better than Final Fantasy Tactics. I would go so far as to say that Tactics is awful at romance, given what happens to the pair that end up being married. As for what occurs when you aren't shipping waifus in Fire Emblem, I think I can say with some certainty that the only similarity is that both games take place on a grid system, in a fantasy setting with turn-based combat. Nearly everything else is different. Fire Emblem has only recently started looking at controlling what your characters can learn in 3 houses. But even then, the level of options your characters have in terms of what they can do still pales in comparison. And as for the story, well, any gravitas with a story in Fire Emblem attempts is usually put on the back burner once I learn that the girl with big boobs has a crush on the main character, so now I have to spend the rest of the game with them next to each other on the battlefield so I can learn how that story ends. World ending? Who cares? I want that ass. Game 3. XCOM. What? A Western-developed game is here? That's right. It's not only the Japanese that know how to make a great strategy RPG, and Firaxis have been doing it for years. XCOM 1 and 2 have a whole host of choices that can be made and tweaked to make your fighting force the best it possibly can be, whether you choose psychic powers, mech suits, range skills, melee skills. If there's a modern or sci-fi way of combat that you can think of, it's probably in XCOM. And that's basically what we're looking for here, right? Choice. And the level of choice for skills and skill sets in XCOM is probably the closest to FFT that I've seen. So why hasn't it surpassed FFT then? It's the story, or lack of it. XCOM revolved around the idea that aliens have invaded the planet and that you are the commander, the head of the resistance effort to get these extraterrestrials off our world. And that's pretty much it. There are cutscenes and things occur in between the beginning and end, but nothing what I would call a cool twist or emotionally interesting. The thing that XCOM does that will tug at the heartstrings, though, is when a character dies, and you lose all that progress with that character. usually from some dice roll not going your way. But honestly, that's very similar to Final Fantasy Tactics 2, only the Square game has a cool story to back it up. Game 4. Front Mission. So if you aren't aware, Front Mission is a Square series, like Final Fantasy Tactics. A strategy RPG on a grid system, like Final Fantasy Tactics. Gives you control over loadout and the skill set of your characters. They're in mechs called Wanzers. Not like FFT, but also like FFT, if you know what I'm saying. As you can see, there is a lot that is similar to Final Fantasy Tactics in Front Mission, in terms of mechanics anyway. The setting is wildly different, however. In Front Mission, the games take place in a near-future timeline, with your character controlling a squad of giant mech suits called Wanzers. It's a great word to use. Say it. Wanzer! And you are usually, I say usually because there's a bunch of Front Mission games, you become involved in a political plot on a global scale. So similar in terms of story too, huh? Why is this not the successor to Final Fantasy Tactics then? Because there is a big problem in Front Mission in terms of its mechanics. Its damage is randomized in combat, and every encounter is based on RNG rather than tactics and skill. In the battle of Final Fantasy Tactics, there are certainly elements of luck involved, with attacks and spells having an amount of percentage chance to miss, but from experience, this chance has been fair to the player. In Front Mission, an attack has a chance to hit, but also when it does hit, a chance to decide where it hits. Wanzers usually have 5 body parts that attacks can hit, and for the most part it's completely random which part it is that you make contact with, meaning that in a close encounter, your tactics can be for nothing if the one enemy you need to destroy becomes lucky enough to have each attack on it be on a different body part, spreading the damage out yet being unable to disable any part of that unit. This feels great when it happens to you, of course, but all too often it seems to happen for the CPU and ends up feeling like a fix. You can of course counter this with safe scumming rounds in battle, but this ability wasn't available to those of us who played it on original hardware. It really sucked. Even when you do have the ability, it doesn't feel great to do. It's a frustrating experience. Game 5. Into the Breach. Another Western developer on here, but it's another fantastic game, and this one came from Subset Games, a tiny indie developer. This choice is probably the most out there on the list, but stick with me on here. So in Into the Breach, you're in command of a time-travelling crew of 3 pilots and their mechs, all of which are interchangeable and customizable through earning currency by being good at the game and killing Vec, and hopefully saving the planet. Okay, so the game has very little story to it, but the mechanics are so on point and so well laid out to the player that it might be the one that feels the most like a puzzle game, rather than a full-blown RPG. But that's okay, because an RPG that doesn't make you think isn't a game that I want to play anyway. Those mechanics are what make me think of Final Fantasy Tactics when playing Into the Breach, by the way. You're given upgrade points incrementally to spend however you wish, whether that's something more mundane, like more health or movement, or something more interesting like a new skill or passive ability. Either way, it's your choice, and that's the kind of freedom we're looking for here. As I said, Into the Breach isn't going for your grey matter in terms of story, and that's where it falls short in terms of a direct comparison. But when looking at gameplay, this one definitely doesn't pull its punches. Game 6. Tactics Ogre. This one is easy to see the similarities to, since Final Fantasy Tactics and Tactics Ogre are both directed by Yasumi Matsuno, and share a lot of the same ideas and mechanics. Inversely, they're the hardest to separate in terms of quality. Tactics Ogre has a better story, and offers several painful choices for you to make on the journey, but the mechanics in FFT are more open to the player, offering more options and different ways to play. On a different day, I could say that Tactics Ogre is probably a better game than Final Fantasy Tactics, but only when I look at those character portraits and the lack of noses. Why did they do that? I mean, people need noses. I mean, look at this thing. Game 7. Triangle Strategy. I put this game on here last because it might be the one most inspired by Final Fantasy Tactics without being made by Matsuno directly. It's also last because it's the most recent on the list, coming out in early 2022, and from what can be gathered, was a good success for Square Enix. Triangle Strategy's premise is that of a land of 3 kingdoms, each with its own precious resource that the others cannot do without, but all vying for control of the others to extend their power and influence. You take control of Serenoa Walford, heir to a powerful house for the Kingdom of Glenbrook, and also friend to Roland Glenbrook, second son of the king. The number of parallels in what happens to Serenoa and Roland when compared to Final Fantasy Tactics, you could almost swap them for Ramzan and Delita and have the story stay exactly the same, depending on your choices. These choices that you make in Triangle Strategy are very important to the outcome of the story, much more so than the few that you do make in Final Fantasy Tactics. I haven't seen them all yet, and as such I'm reluctant to say which one is better than the other, such is the level of importance they have over the plot. In terms of gameplay, however, there are some nice quality of life changes that speed things up when compared to Final Fantasy Tactics. Most notably that any levels gained during a failed mission are retained for you to have an edge when you repeat them. Unfortunately, that isn't enough to sway what I consider to be the greatest system of mechanics in the history of strategy RPGs, though. Because when you compare these directly, Triangle Strategy is simply outclassed. See what I did there? The way that Triangle Strategy doles out your skills and upgrades is through a currency and crafting items, but the range and choice that's on offer pales in comparison. I will say, though, that the side missions that the game gives you to acquire these crafting items remind me a lot of Disgaea, since a lot of them take place in side missions rather than the main story, but seem necessary all the same because of the ramping levels of difficulty. Meaning that you're given the choice of either fulfilling the side missions to keep pace with what the game demands of you, or retry the main story missions until your characters catch up. Either way, you're playing the game by its rules, rather than taking control of your own destiny, as it feels in Final Fantasy Tactics. I completed Triangle Strategy, but did not go into the New Game Plus, which at least seemed to offer a lot of content to players, with the opportunity to see what other choices could be made and new characters to be recruited. This was a pleasant surprise in this world of DLC expansions, and I think it brings a lot of replay value to the game, which Final Fantasy Tactics does feature in the late game, but doesn't place it behind the idea of a New Game Plus, and I'm not sure if that's a good idea or not. Overall, I think Triangle Strategy does a decent job of continuing the legacy of Final Fantasy Tactics, while still falling short of what I'm chasing. A story-driven strategy RPG that gives you the freedom to dominate your foes however you wish, with a massive wealth of options available to you. There are, of course, more strategy RPGs out there, but these are the ones that I feel are most likely to have been inspired by, or straight up stolen from Final Fantasy Tactics for their own benefit. The ones that aren't here are either ones that I haven't played, because there are many, or they just don't have what I quantify as the most important thing that Final Fantasy Tactics has: player choice. If you've played Final Fantasy Tactics, then you know all about the depth that you can go into with your job choices and skill sets that each character can have, making it feel like a game of Dungeons & Dragons with a whole squad under your control, with every class open to you and mixing and matching of skills and spells being allowed. It's incredible. If you haven't played Final Fantasy Tactics, what the hell are you doing reading and watching this? Go and get into this deep, deep rabbit hole of possibilities and strategies. Go and figure out how broken you can become straight away if you just manage your characters right and put the right skills together. It's a great time, I assure you. I'm just disappointed it hasn't been bettered yet. Thank you for watching this video. Please feel free to like and subscribe, and I'll see you all next time. Ciao.